Welcome to another exciting round of the Public Sector Debate Competition 2025. I'm your host, Aniki Clark, Communication Lead in the TIU. Can you believe it that we're now at the quarterfinals? Yes, the very exciting round where the top 8 teams will match wits and arguments to determine which teams move on to the semifinals. We're so happy that you could have joined us, be it here at our offices at 6 Saxthorpe Avenue or via our YouTube channel. As I said, today, we're going to hear some arguments from what we're dubbing the Elite Eight. It has been a riveting contest so far, and we want to commend all the teams that have participated. They have represented their organizations well. But we said farewell in the last round to 8 teams, and we really would like to commend them and to thank them for their participation in the competition. And remember, if you miss those matches, you can always catch up via our social media platforms, be that Facebook or YouTube. But this morning, we get things started with the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Mining and the Water Resources Authority. And they are kicking off the quarterfinals, and guess what? They're debating a very topical MOOT. It is be it resolved that economic sanctions do more harm than good in dealing with totalitarian regimes. Right? Let me read that again for you. Be it resolved that economic sanctions do more harm than good in dealing with totalitarian regimes. But before we get into the arguments, we need to meet the teams, right? Right, Jermaine? Indeed. So at this point, I will invite Team Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Mining to introduce themselves.
All right, good morning, host. Tyrion Wright, Prime Minister.
Tyrion with me. Okay.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Andre Bogle. I am the second speaker.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Shalika Darby, and I am the third speaker.
Thank you so much, Team Agriculture, Fisheries and Mining. Let's now get to meet Team Water Resources Authority.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Colleen Peter-McNaught, and I'm the first speaker.
Good morning. My name is Kimoy Marie Douglas, and I'm the second speaker.
Good morning. My name is Jeffrey Marshall, and I'm the third speaker.
Thank you so much, Team Water Resources Authority. Let's give them a round of applause. They would have been preparing for this day. And to judge their arguments, we have our partners from the Jamaican Association for Debating and Empowerment, JADE. Judges, please introduce yourselves.
Thank you very much, Aniki. Good morning, teams. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jermaine Barrett. I'm the chair adjudicator for this match, and I'm excited to be at the quarterfinal round.
I'm sure.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Roshana Jarrett, and I'll serve as one of your wing adjudicators for this match.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. The name is Javon Downey, and I'll also serve as a wing adjudicator in this match.
Thank you so much, judges. It's a long day, right? We have 4 matches for the quarterfinal rounds. The teams are familiar with the rules, and so at this point I will hand over to Jermaine, who will marshal the debate. Good luck, teams.
Thank you very much again, Aniki Clark. Ladies and gentlemen, viewers, if you're just joining us, welcome, welcome, welcome. And just to aid you in terms of understanding the proceedings, I'll go quickly through the rules. So you will see 2 teams, the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Mining going up against the Water Resources Authority, each team having 3 debaters, and you'll see the first debater on each team speaking for approximately 7 minutes, the second speaker will speak for 6 minutes, and the third speaker speaks for 5 minutes. After the first pair of speeches, as the first opposition speaker, you'll witness an exciting and enthralling cross-examination segment. When we get to that segment, I'll explain in greater detail the rules. You'll see another segment of cross-examination after the second pair of speeches. After that second cross-examination, we will enter a brief moment of pause, 1 minute pause, to allow them to catch their breaths and collect their thoughts ahead of the reply speeches. The first reply speaker you'll hear will be that from the opposition team, Team Water Resources Authority. And then to conclude the debate, we'll hear the final submission from the proposition team, Team Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Mining. The first two speakers on each team have what we call protected time. So you'll hear the ding of the bell first to indicate that you've spoken for 1 minute. Another ding of the bell signals that you have 1 minute to go. And then ultimately 2 dings of the bell signals that you are about out of time. You get the continuous dinging of the bell at the 15 seconds additional grace period. There you have it. And that signals that you are to stop and take your seat. Debaters, are you ready? Yes, sir. All right, you sound very ready. Good, so we now call upon the first proposition speaker to open the debate, coming to us from the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Mining.
All right, so members of the House, today we're here to evaluate the impact of economic sanctions in the context of dealing with totalitarian regimes. Mr. Speaker, imperative to this conversation is having a thorough understanding of the nightmare that totalitarian regimes are. As first speaker, I will go to the heart of the nature of totalitarian regimes and why economic sanctions are ineffective and result in greater harm than good. My second speaker will further our position by proving the ineffectiveness of sanctions with hard data and by detailing the sweeping harms that they impose on citizens, neighbors, and even the sanctioning states themselves, Mr. Speaker. Our rebuttal speaker will cement our stance, proving to this House why we have won this debate. Before we proceed, Mr. Speaker, allow me to kindly define some key terms. So first, when we speak about economic sanctions, these are the deliberate government-inspired withdrawal or threat of withdrawal of customary trade or financial relations. More specifically, Mr. Speaker, they refer to punitive measures, for example, prohibiting trade, stopping financial transactions, or barring economic assistance that are imposed by one country, a group of countries, or a multilateral body such as the United Nations on the target country, entity, or group of individuals that violate international norms. Mr. Speaker, the definition of totalitarian regimes or totalitarianism is a system of government that is centralized and dictatorial and requires complete subservience to the state. However, Mr. Speaker, I will take you behind the Iron Curtain and show how the mere definition does not comprise the total horror of living under a totalitarian regime. So dealing with, in this context, as defined by the Cambridge Dictionary, is to take action to achieve something or solve a problem. The economic sanctions have historically been applied against totalitarian regimes to induce transitions to democratic society or behavior change among the leadership of the regime. So our arguments will prove that the economic sanctions have little effect in solving the targeted problem, and the sanctioning state or institutions withdraw the sanctions as they are not only costly to maintain, but create gravely debilitating and destructive effects on the sanctioning and sanctioned states. So while we prove through decades of factual statistical evidence, Mr. Speaker, and sound reasoning, the opposition will provide you with debunked theoretical and mythical reasoning that would suggest that the pain inflicted by sanctions on citizens of target states will cause them to pressure their government into making the changes demanded by the sanctioning body. This has been proven erroneous, Mr. Speaker, and their arguments will show that they do not understand the true nature of the regimes. So one, Mr. Speaker, imagine living in a totalitarian world where there is constant monitoring and oppression, no room for opposition. The government dictates every aspect of your life, controlling all information, media, work, worship, every resource, and every person, and seek to subdue the mind and will more than Jesus Christ himself. This, Mr. Speaker, is what life under totalitarian rule looks like. Totalitarian regimes derive their legitimacy from an arsenal of tools, weaponry, state-sponsored terror, and intimidation that forces their nationals to remain oppressed, fearful, and silent. the resources you have access to are entirely dependent on the government, including food, which means they can choose to kill or starve you if they suspect treason or any form of opposition. In this environment, you can clearly see the deeply deleterious effects emerging from locking this kind of society in on itself, suffocating the economic realities of the people on poisons of their dictatorial oppressors, armed, dangerous, and motivated. Therefore, if it is perceived that sanctions will force the uprising of a majority to force a totalitarian government to change its behavior or to peacefully transition to a democratic society, this is theory. In reality, Mr. Speaker, under totalitarian control, those who challenge the oppressive military torture enforced by the state are frequently martyred, murdered publicly, jailed, or severely punished. In reality, citizens face a dual punishment of the innocent, both the crippling of their own lives and livelihoods. Mr. Speaker, to go further, as a result of their clinical dictatorial God complexes, totalitarian leaders redouble their efforts to strengthen and retain control in the face of economic sanctions. They see these sanctions, Mr. Speaker, as acts of war. As such, the sanctions provide opportunities to strengthen their legitimacy. What does this mean? With their full control over information and the media, they drive home the poisonous ideologies and prove that those applying the sanctions are the enemy trying to kill them. However, the regime will do everything in its power to protect them from this enemy and to keep some of them, the ones who are compliant, alive, Mr. Speaker. The vulnerability of the people is compounded by resource scarcities caused by sanctions, further forcing the citizens to believe these ideologies as they are the worst affected by the sanctions. These pressures heighten the suffering, stripping them of access to critical resources, medicines, food, work, travel, etc. We point you to the vivid examples of the 1990s, Mr. Speaker, as UNICEF reported over 500,000 children perishing as a result of the economic sanctions, drastically reducing access to food, medicines, and other necessities, Mr. Speaker. Yet, in these regimes, they redouble, they do not retreat. Even when sanctions are applied directly to the leaders, the results are the same. More resources are diverted from the citizens to the sanctioned leaders who use the engine of the state to reject critical avenues for trade and vital resources for the people. These factors, Mr. Speaker, create damage over time, increasing suffering and harm that citizens under totalitarian regimes would have to endure, further locking them into a vacuum of dependence, mind control, decades of suffering, and even death. Yet with all this destruction, Mr. Speaker, the economic sanctions are proven to be ineffective as tools to bring about the solvency of the targeted issues with totalitarian regimes, Mr. Speaker. I want to close making reference to a study titled The Unintended Consequences. All right, let me just move. So, in closing, Mr. Speaker, supporting studies have demonstrated that most sanctions have been lifted prematurely because the intended goal for which they were imposed could not be achieved. This is an acknowledgement of their ineffectiveness and their role in causing disastrous consequences, Mr. Speaker. As a logical thinking, reasonable proposition, how can we accept this? And the proposition pauses.
Thank you very much for that excellent start to what is shaping up to be an excellent debate. Ladies and gentlemen, we welcome at this time the first opposition speaker coming to us from the Water Resources Authority. Let's make that speaker welcome.
The sanctions will not kill us. It's apartheid that is killing us. Those are the words of someone who lived in a totalitarian regime. Colleagues, opponents, judges, this quotation exemplifies the true harm which economic sanctions aim to restrain. That is, the harm imposed within and without from the totalitarian regimes seeking to disrupt global or regional stability by various means. We oppose the MOOT as stated and instead resolve that economic sanctions do more good than harm in their intended execution. As the first speaker, I will speak on the benefits of economic sanctions from an economic and security standpoint and how these impact on the greater good by restraining totalitarian regimes. Our second speaker will focus on the social and symbolic impacts of sanctions on the greater good, and our third speaker will recapitulate our case and underscore that sanctions are vital for the global good. In addition to the proposition's definitions, we add that by smashing autonomous business interests at the outset, the regime ensures that every hard currency dollar earned by a state firm can be diverted into repression, overseas subversion, or elite lifestyles. Examples include North Korea, Stalinist Russia, Nazi Germany, and while not fully totalitarian, authoritarian states like China that exhibit similar characteristics. While we acknowledge that the possibility exists where the citizens underneath the totalitarian regime may also be collaterally impacted by these sanctions, we believe that the greater good of combating the regime's breaches is worth the time-limited impact of the imposed sanctions, especially since modern sanctions today have evolved from bludgeons to scalpels with built-in humanitarian exceptions and a strong focus on the macroeconomic pipeline of the target nation. We would also like to add another definition, and that is harm. This we want to consider as a multifaceted concept that considers both the immediate negative impacts of economic sanctions and the larger strategic and ethical objectives they aim to achieve. With these definitions, we see that the harm caused by the totalitarian regime is the breach of international norms. This may include acts of military aggression against neighboring countries, intentional disruption of global economic structure, internal oppression, and violation of human rights against its citizens. Economic sanctions are therefore used by the international community as a means to limit the regime's capacity to perpetuate those breaches, which is the greater good for the international community. How do these sanctions lead to greater good? Let's look at economic strangulation. Totalitarian regimes use revenue streams to finance internal repression, external aggression, and the tools that keep the population docile. To reduce the harm inflicted by totalitarian rulers without resorting to war, outside actors must target the feeds, not the bodies of the machine. Economic sanctions are that feed choke instrument via these actions. Look at revenue denial. In the 1990s, UN sanctions cut off Libya's oil income and access to key imports, crippling its economy. Facing the squeeze, the regime scrapped its weapon program and paid compensation, after which sanctions were lifted and normal trade resumed, a clear case of pressure delivering reform. Capital flight. Sanctions triggered a 10.8 billion capital exodus from apartheid South Africa, convincing white business leaders that the system was economic suicide and pushing them to demand change. The resulting pressure hastened the peaceful transition to majority rule, culminating in Nelson Mandela's election and a full political and economic rights for Black South Africans. Clear proof that sanctions can do more good than harm against totalitarian regimes. Together, these measures don't just restrict revenue. They raise operational costs, isolate the regime financially, and gradually erode its ability to sustain repression. Global security and military degradation. The strength of regimes' military is directly proportional to its economic ability to support that military in logistics, research and development, and budget for all related expenses. As such, the economic degradation also degrades the military readiness and limits the regime's capacity for aggressive expansion and forcible occupation of neighboring territories. Sanctions that restrict dual-use technologies, aviation fuel, and scientific exchange directly weaken a regime's ability to harm itself. Take, for instance, Russia. Trade sanctions blocked Russia from importing microchips, so they had to salvage parts from washing machines. What did this result in? This left them weaker. Their missiles were weaker and less accurate. Myanmar, after jet fuel sanctions, airstrikes dropped by 55% in 2023, reducing the civilian casualty rates. Thus far, we can see that sanctions are the less harmful, least cost, reversible, law-based alternative to war as a response to international breaches from totalitarian regimes. The proposition therefore carries the burden to prove that the international community is better off when the cash taps reopen for tyrants because of the failure to implement tariffs or the decision to appease instead of confront. History, economics, and human rights matrix indicate they will not meet that burden. The opposition rests. Pause it.
Thank you very much. First opposition speaker. Indeed, we have a debate in our hands. Wow. All right, so we continue our debate now with the first segment of cross-examination. In this segment, the opposition team, Team Water Resources Authority, gets a chance to ask 3 questions of the proposition team, Team Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries, and Mining. The questions are each limited to 10 seconds. The responses limited to 30 seconds. After that first phase of the first segment of cross-examination, we'll then flip and allow the Ministry of Agriculture, the proposition team, to ask their 3 questions of the opposition team. Team Water Resources Authority, you may now ask your questions.
Thank you. If sanctions do more harm than good, why does lifting them often lead to worse outcomes?
Lifting them doesn't often lead to worse outcomes. Lifting them allows for the populations to revitalize themselves because from the outcomes that were caused by the economic sanctions. When you cut off trade, when you cut off banking access, you affect the population, not the regime.
Isn't the suffering of civilians primarily caused by their own government's policies, not the sanctions?
And that is precisely the point. They're already suffering. So you're adding a double dose of suffering when you implement sanctions.
And therefore you're doing more harm than good, just to drive it home.
Wouldn't the lack of sanctions encourage the regimes to believe they can act without consequence?
Absolutely not. There are consequences, and there are many, many, many other approaches that can be taken outside of crippling an entire population or generation with these sanctions that prevent them from growing past or even being able to rebel against the government that is oppressing them. No, economic sanctions aren't the only option.
All right, thank you very much, Water Resources Authority, for your 3 questions. We now invite 3 questions from the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries, and Mining posed to the Water Resources Authority.
Okay, so how do you account for the God complexes of totalitarian regime leaders who see sanctions as a means to further oppress their people?
The God complexes of those persons, if such a thing exists for them, will be impacted because the sanctions show them that they are not God. The sanctions limit their ability to earn money, their ability to do things, and as such, the sanctions, as our second speaker will show, limit them, cap them, and force them to change in many ways, more ways than one.
If these sanctions force them to change, then why is it that after examining 1,587 sanctions over 70 years, only 22% of them were found to be successful?
The implementation of sanctions is not a one-size-fits-all necessarily. You have to look at the context for all of those, assuming that your statistics are correct. However, what we will be showing are where the sanctions that have been implemented for a specific purpose based on a specific action have led to a reaction that has been proven that the sanctions itself achieved the greater good that it was intended to do, and also shows why sanctions, even today, are still being used by the international society as responses to these regimes' actions.
All right, you mentioned military strength, but how does sanctions actually affect alliances? Because if one country has an alliance that can provide them with military weapons, how do you go against that with sanctions?
Our second speaker will show an example where Russia, being hit with sanctions, found out that Indonesia, having seen the sanctions, refused to buy jets from them because of the sanctions that were implemented. An army runs on the economy. With no economy, the army will then be diminished. So sanctions have a long impact and effect on both the economy and the military strength.
All right, thank you to both teams for an exciting segment of cross-examination. I think they deserve a round of applause. And so I'm interested to hear the additional arguments promised in this debate. So let's go. We welcome at this time the second proposition speaker to advance Team Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries case. Hear, hear.
Ladies and gentlemen, adjudicators, my opposition, and my proposing team, good morning. Before I get into it, let me just touch on one other point that the opposition team made. They mentioned that economic sanctions push forward towards the greater good, that the greater good is worth it. But like I said before, they only work 22% of the time, and that's being generous. And I have the proper source to prove it. I cannot wait to get into it. Not to mention Libya. They mentioned that Libya would have benefited from the economic sanctions that were enacted on them, but isn't Libya still suffering and struggling today? In fact, the benefits that Libya received that caused them to move out of that period of time of hardship that was caused by the sanctions was because of diplomatic solutions and assistance from neighbors and well-minded countries around the world. The opposition insists that economic sanctions are a good way to discipline totalitarian rulers. Yet, their own argument concedes that sanctions cause serious suffering. Our task today, then, is to show that this suffering is vast, the strategic gain is rare, and therefore, on balance, economic sanctions do more harm than good. First, let me reinforce a critical point that my first speaker has already made. Economic sanctions against totalitarian regimes have debilitating effects on the lives that are inside the regimes and not the leaders themselves. The regimes double down, they do not retreat. Economic sanctions can have some small amount of positive impacts and induce concessions or behavior changes, sure. But that is exactly why policymakers reach for them, because the harms that they induce should coerce these leaders into making changes. The problem is that the harm lands almost entirely on innocent people, while the regime takes control of even more resources, tighten their grip on the minds of the people by leveraging sanctions as an example of a cruel external enemy causing their suffering, and weaponize the people's desperation for food and necessities, forcing them into destitution and total compliance. The regime seldom change as a result of sanctions, and the leaders are Teflon dons, untouched. From this angle, we can see how sanctions are simply ineffective. But let me put numbers to that. According to the Global Sanctions Database, which tracks 1,587 sanction episodes from 1950 to 2023, only 22% of them achieved their stated goal. And when the target is highly authoritarian states, the success rate collapses to 11%. In other words, 4 out of 5 times we inflict pain and suffering that translates to the people, and 88% of the time, the totalitarian regime redoubles down. The people's suffering is worsened by the sanctions. The problem is made worse and is not solved. So, what happens instead? Even more harmful effects. Every time you impose sanctions, you create predictable, measurable harms, and they hit 4 groups. Mentioned before, innocent citizens. Next, the neighboring states that rely on cross-border trade, the wider global economy as supply chains seize up. And yes, even the sanctioning countries themselves through higher prices and lost job markets. Let's talk economics. Sanctions don't only affect the sanctioned country, but the sanctioning country. Economic sanctions come at a cost to the sanctioning country and are difficult to maintain. Sanctions often rely on blocking access to a resource or service under the sanctioning country's control. But this backfires and often weakens the country's monopoly on the resource as their competitors take advantage of the power vacuum. I wonder what happened when we tried to restrict Russia's oil exports. It seems like they made a stronger connection to China, and that's a current threat that we're experiencing right now. Hold on, economic sanctions causing more harm than good? Yeah, no, that sounds about right. Let's consider the very measured and hand-approximate example of Russia, as I have just done. Renowned economists and researchers like Kailash K. Pashrad has juxtaposed Russia's early decline in trade with the European Union under the economic sanctions, with what they define as spikes in trade between Russia and Armenia as well. They force market diversification and diminish export outcomes for sanctioned countries' private sector. Listen to me, there are far more harms than good. Let's look at health. I want to slow down on a critical example that my first speaker would have made. The UN's comprehensive embargo on Iraq and the economic sanctions that they imposed from 1990 to 1998 blocked life-saving oncology drugs and spare parts from medical equipment that contributed to 500,000 excess children deaths. What was the goal? To force regime change in Saddam Hussein. What was the result? The regime did not change, and 500,000 children paid with their lives. That's the definition of more harms than good. No good and 500,000 deaths. Was it worth it? Was the death of these children worth the cost of these economic sanctions? No, Mr. Speaker. What has been proven is that economic sanctions do not affect the regime, are slow at producing any solvency, but have cataclysmic human life sacrifices. Mr. Speaker, I'm out of time. There's so many more I could say, but the proposition rests.
I think we all thank the second proposition speaker for that fine speech, and now call upon the second opposition speaker to do likewise. Hear, hear.
Good day. Our first speaker has shown how economic sanctions weaken the financial and military foundation of totalitarian regimes. But let me start. Our opponents say economic sanctions cause more suffering, yet they fail to acknowledge that these sanctions are aimed at the top and do not stop the flow of food or other necessities for the citizens. They say there are other alternatives, and yet they cannot provide a single one. History has chosen war. Are bombs better? We are forced to believe that this is their stance. They say that the sanctions have not fixed Libya, even though we have said sanctions limit their strength. The reason they are even having these diplomatic talks is because of the weight of sanctions. Additionally, they say sanctions fail, yet they ignore that they are a tool meant to be used in tandem with others. To look at them independently is to step out of reality. I now extend our case by showing how these same economic tools lead to elite fracture, regional and global deterrence, they prevent the consequences of premature relief, and they limit the international spread of forced labor economies. First, economic sanctions trigger elite fracture by cutting off access to comfort, capital, and overseas assets. Sanctions freeze foreign reserves, block luxury imports, and deny access to SWIFT, and they don't hurt ordinary citizens. They force the regime's elites to bear the cost of repression. In Iran, after the 2018 sanction snapbacks, Oil exports fell, the rail collapsed, and the infighting broke out within the Revolutionary Guard, culminating in leadership purges in Isfahan. These cracks weren't mere palace drama. They weakened the state's iron grip and opened the space for the broadest street protests since 1979. In short, the same economic pressures that rattled the elite delivered an unmistakable good, breathing room and hope for ordinary Iranians, especially outweighing the temporary shocks it caused. Second, economic sanctions serve as regional and global deterrents against totalitarian models. Totalitarianism spreads when it appears to offer cheap prosperity and unchecked power without consequence. Sanctions stop that illusion. When the West sanctioned Russia after its invasion of Ukraine, Indonesia canceled a Russia fighter jet deal, fearing US secondary sanctions. Again, the deterrent wasn't symbolic. It was a real financial risk. Sanctions don't just penalize, they block alliances and discourage imitation. Third, the removal of sanctions too early often reverses the progress and proves their necessity. In Myanmar, sanctions were lifted between 2012 and 2015 to reward reforms. Trade resumed and investments flowed in. But in 2017, the Rhodesia genocide occurred. In 2021, the military staged a coup. The sanctions relief bankrolled repression, not reform. North Korea tells the same story. After the 2018 summit thaw, luxury goods resumed flowing in. Within a year, missile testing restarted. Sanction relief did not tame the regime, it recharged it. This is consistent. Sanctions are not just symbolic, they are a cap. Lift that cap too soon and the repression accelerates. That means sanctions do not do more harm, they prevent worse harm. Fourth, economic sanctions reduce global dependence on forced labor economies, which harm both morality and the middle class in free nations. In 1991, Uzbekistan used state-run forced labor to pick cotton. The ultra-cheap fiber flooded world markets, undercutting growers in domestic countries and funneling cash back to the regime. It showed how forced labor economies harm both ethics and middle-class jobs abroad. Sanctions that block goods produced with forced labor don't just support human rights. They protect domestic industries from moral and economic erosion, and they prevent foreign firms from enabling totalitarian economies for profit. Furthermore, the notion that sanctions mainly, not at this time, victimize ordinary civilians is no longer accurate. Modern sanctions come with built-in humanitarian exemptions. The UN mandates exemptions for food, medicine, and NGO access. During the COVID-19 pandemic, US approvals allowed Cuba to import 40% more vaccines under these provisions. These aren't loopholes, they're legal safeguards that make sanctions more humane and more targeted than ever before. The real test is this: if sanctions do more harm than good, then lifting them should improve conditions both locally and internationally. But as we've shown, relief has often enabled worse outcomes, not better ones. And finally, if sanctions are removed, what's left? War? Silence? Statements of concern? Sanctions are the world's main non-violent, reversible, and enforceable mechanism for punishing breaches of international norms. They hit where it matters: the funding streams that support repression and military aggression of these regimes. In conclusion, economic sanctions fracture the regime's elite and fuel internal pressure. They deter both neighbors and trading partners from embracing totalitarian models. Their removal often triggers rapid harm, proving their power to contain damage, and they shield the rest of the world from the corrosive effects of forced labor economies. To claim economic sanctions do more harm than good is to ignore the damage they prevent, the alliances that never form, the regimes that fail to rise, and the profits that never reach the hands of the dictators. We therefore oppose the motion. The opposition pauses.
We thank the second opposition speaker for that fine speech. And now no, not just yet. We enter now the second segment of cross-examination. We, in this segment, will be guided by the rules aforementioned. So at this time, I call upon the opposition team to furnish their 3 questions, posing those questions to the proposition team.
What options other than sanctions do you have to handle totalitarian regimes?
Diplomacy, incentivizing good behaviors. In the absolute, I just gave you 2, but in the absolute worst case scenario, tactical military intervention. Target the specific individual, not the entire country, their region, and global economic stability. Those are the alternatives. Next question.
Okay, so war, other words. All right. If sanctions hurt civilians, do you believe that letting dictators freely access wealth is a better alternative?
Absolutely not. In fact, that's why we disagree with economic sanctions, because what they do is they constrain the resources in their regime, causing them to dole out the accesses to those critical resources only to the people that are most important and close to them. It allows them to strengthen their relationships with their allies that enable them to undertake these actions that are against our democratic norms. And so, there we go.
As you have described, these regimes are led by powerful persons who don't listen. How do you expect to have diplomatic talks if you don't have some threat to force them to come to the table?
I absolutely love it. I'm an economist. In economics, they talk about incentives. That's how you get change. At the end of the day, we look at the carrot versus the stick. You have to incentivize the behavior that you want them to undertake. Now, if they aren't going to do it, you have to use a scalpel and not a huge machine gun that's going to destroy everything. And that's what economic sanctions are.
Like war.
All right. I see the water resources team edging for a response. All right, so we now invite the questions to be sent forth from the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Mining, posed to the Water Resources Authority.
All right, so what is your response to alternative sources of funding, such as the black market? Because you try to point legitimate funding as the only option, but what about the black market and other illegal alternatives?
The black market is something that has existed far before sanctions. Free countries like the US still use the black market. Sanctions do not cause them to use the black market if they're using an alternative that already exists. That's not an effect of sanctions. That's something that would have happened before, and that does not justify sanctions causing more harm if they're using a route that already exists.
So if I can get access to my resources otherwise, why should I worry about sanctions?
The evidence doesn't support that, because the black market is much more challenging, much more uneconomical to access per se. It doesn't relate to the point of the sanction, which is that the sanctions force the persons to find alternative, more inconvenient, more costly ways. If they could get the goods away from the black market, then they would. So again, as my colleague said, the black market existence will always be there when there's a constriction on a particular good for the people to get it that way. That does not negate the impact of a sanction.
Final question?
The opposition would have indicated that the economic sanctions serve as a deterrent for other totalitarian regimes. But how is this possible when it is statistically proven that none of these economic sanctions, or most of these economic sanctions, do not work? The totalitarian regimes take these sanctions for a joke.
If the regime took the sanctions for a joke, then they would not be asking for the sanctions to be lifted, nor would sanctions still be a tool used by the economic condition today. The statistics you've stated would again need to be put in context, because we still don't quite accept that. We have shown many examples and will continue to show examples of how sanctions have had an impact. And again, the impact of sanctions will never always be an immediate thing, but it's the long game that is played, because though the patience to outlast those dictators was needed to ensure that justice and the greater good prevails in the long run.
All right, so with that, we've come to the conclusion of the second segment of cross-examination. A round of applause, please. Indeed, indeed. And so we now get to that 1 minute pause, much deserved. So we will take that pause. At the end of the 1 minute pause, we will resume with the reply speaker from Team Water Resources Authority, the opposition side, and then I'll ultimately conclude the debate with the reply speaker from Team Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Mining. Your 1 minute begins now. All right, the dreaded bell signaling the end of your 1 minute reprieve. Let's get the match resumed. We now call upon the reply speaker from Team Water Resources Authority to put the finishing touches on that team's case. Hear, hear.
1, 2. A good thing which prevents us from enjoying a greater good is in truth an evil, from Baruch Spinoza. Our opponents have not provided any alternatives to economic sanctions except diplomacy. But diplomacy will not be anything to anyone who is ignoring and doing actions that demand a sanction in the first place. And so our opponents are focused on the unfortunate impacts of economic sanctions on populations without looking at the wider picture of the application. For example, while we can look with regret at the impact of sanctions on the population of North Korea, we must also look at the potential lives saved of both North and South Koreans by the reduced capacity of North Korea to wage military aggression and the continued aversion of open warfare due to the economic constraints limiting their military. Our first speaker set the framework by indicating the breaches by these regimes of international norms. That forces them to go to the black market, which makes it harder because if the sanctions weren't there, they wouldn't be going to the black market in the first place. The delicate stability, or the delicate balance of global stability among different countries with different philosophies of government requires international collaboration to ensure security for all global citizens as far as possible. When a regime takes actions to disrupt the stability for whatever reason, the actions taken by these regimes demands a response from the international community. Our first speaker clearly showed that economical sanctions are one of the responses available from the community to counteract these disruptive actions. And the greater good which comes from this response to limit the regime's capacity is worth the temporary discomfort which may be felt by the civilian population, especially if the sanctions are now laser focused with humanitarian exceptions rather than a huge club being wielded indiscriminately. Our second speaker further showed the harm that prevails when sanctions are removed prematurely or not utilized. What does the proverb say? Give them an inch, they will take a mile. And we see that in the release of sanctions of North Korea in 2018 led to the resumption of military aggression on their part. While there are multiple factors involved with international diplomacy, and the carrot must indeed be used along with the stick, you still need the stick. Because regimes like this, they respond mainly to force, power, and strength. This can be hard strength, catastrophic military action, which negatively impacts everyone. War is not a good option, but sometimes it's the only option, but not in this stance. You can use that, or you can use soft strength, economic sanctions, the velvet glove shielding the iron fist. So if we were to say, remove sanctions that are hurting the people, how does that view account for the reality that the people are already harmed by the regime that rules them and will be further harmed or exploited if the sanctions are removed? As Oliver Tambo said from South Africa, sanctions are not killing us, apartheid is killing us. To say that sanctions do more harm than good is a blinkered view which does not consider the reality of international relations and the importance of appropriate responses to bad faith totalitarian regimes seeking advantage of any vulnerabilities they perceive. I reiterate our second speaker's point. If sanctions do more harm than good, then lifting them should improve conditions both globally and locally. The facts have shown that this is not the case. The international community's non-response or tepid response to actions of regimes has always empowered these regimes to continue their exploitative actions. This is appeasement and will always lead to greater harm for all parties. While economic sanctions can never be the sole method of containment, their proven strategic, focused, symbolic, and economic impacts on these regimes is documented as a greater good, and our patience, paired with diplomatic pressure and other actions, has been proved to eventually lead to a positive outcome for the global community. The greater good to international stability, facilitated by economic sanctions, is worth the cost of any discomfort arising from these sanctions. As long as there are bad faith actors prepared to disrupt international stability, economic sanctions will remain a pragmatic, soft power response to curtail these disruptions towards the service of the greater good. The opposition rests.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes the case on behalf of Team Water Resources Authority, the opposition side. We thank the reply speaker from that team. And now, ladies and gentlemen, to bring the curtains down on this rather exciting and, dare I say, mind-expanding contest, we now invite the reply speaker from the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Mining. Hear, hear, the proposition team's reply.
Mr. Speaker, it has been the profound pleasure of the proposition team to present the MOOT as proponents of reason backed by statistical and historical evidence that proves that economic sanctions do more harm than good when dealing with totalitarian regimes. I wish to pause to highlight and remind the opposition that the MOOT is simply this: economic sanctions do more harm than good against totalitarian regimes. We are not here to convince the judges of all the examples and all the other options and all the other things to consider. We are here to demonstrate, and we have demonstrated, that economic sanctions, in fact, in evidence, in statistics, in data, in the realities of those living under the regimes, do more harm than good. As proponents of the truth, we have also demonstrated brilliantly, of course, my first speaker, how terrible these totalitarian regimes are. The intended change that is required by the totalitarian regimes often do not come because the systematic machines of oppression and control are simply compounded by the God complexes that these leaders simply have. Therefore, your economic sanctions strengthen their resolve, it strengthens their ideology, and of course it comes at a significant expense to the people who you considered collateral damage. They are the ones suffering harm. They're the ones suffering heightened hunger, loss of access to necessaries, loss of access to medicines. Of course, my first and second speaker brought home the point of the 500,000 children
you called collateral damage, that would have suffered as a result of these economic sanctions. I want to further raise the point that you would have shared, of course, that these sanctions provide a deterrent. Data has shown that 11% of these sanctions over 70 years, that's 7 decades, have proven to be have proven to be effective. Therefore, 89% of the sanctions are actually ineffective. You are saying that the sanctions are simply being lifted prematurely. I wish to remind you and ask you, how long would you want these children to suffer? How long do you want the people under the regimes to suffer? 70 years of data for you is not enough. And let us not forget that the countries also levying these sanctions do suffer. The businesses, the MSMEs, those individuals who are seeking to diversify and take use and utilize the market access opportunities provided to them are stymied. They are restricted and restrained, losing market access opportunities. Your same constituents will no longer have access to that income earned. And of course, that affects your GDP, your children, your people, and the development of course, your country. I want to raise a few other points that would have been shared. My colleagues would have highlighted the importance of considering tactical military action when needed, but the third and second speaker on the opposition side would have suggested that military action can be stymied because of the sanctions. I wish to reaffirm the point raised that when these sanctions are applied, the countries against whom the sanctions are applied merely strengthen their alliances and are flushed with resources, with military support. They retrench, they redouble, they do not retreat. Your humanitarian exemptions, as mentioned, are statistically also proven to not work. Your forced labor suggestions that would have been raised by your second speaker are again statistically proven to not work. These economic sanctions are causing more damage to the human lives that are affected, and they are not yielding this result that you are suggesting will come. I want to finally go back to the second speaker's point, because I really had to thank her, Mr. Speaker, when I heard her state that really, in fact, it's demonstrated the sanctions don't work. Even with time, they are not working. And her suggestion is that they just simply need more time to work, more time to work. 70 years of data does not work. Lifting the sanctions, the problem is still there because the problem never went away. We have provided surgical options. We have provided the data that demonstrates that simply the economic sanctions cause more damage to the human lives worse affected than they do provide good results. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I want to raise that even in the situations where there are, even in the situations, for example, in North Korea, where we have had sanctions being imposed at least from 2006 to 2023, is it that the opposition is saying that these sanctions have proven to cause regime change? They have not. The results of the sanctions are simply this: they do not work, they cause more harm than good. Thank you.
Thank you very much, reply speaker from the proposition team. Ladies and gentlemen, that signals the end of this debate. At this time, I turn over gladly to Madam Aniki Clark while I refresh myself ahead of the deliberations.
Thank you so much, Jermaine. Let's hear it for the teams once again. This has been indeed a cracking start to the quarterfinals. It's a quality match, right? The arguments are solid, and you happily hand it over to me, Jermaine. I'll happily hand over back to you because I would want to be an adjudicator in this match. But for those of you online, just to remind you of the MOOT, they debated, be it resolved that economic sanctions do more harm than good in dealing with totalitarian regimes. What are your views? Let us know. Keep the conversation going. And at this point, I will just say well done to Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries, Mining, and well done, Water Resources Authority of Jamaica. In a few minutes, the judges will return to announce the winner of the match and the best speaker. For those of you online, stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Ladies and gentlemen, viewers, welcome, welcome, welcome back. It's time for the results of this exciting match that just ended. Now, to remind you, the MOOT that was engaged with by both teams focused on whether or not it does more harm than good, this matter of imposing harsh economic sanctions on totalitarian regimes, yes? And the teams contesting vigorously and valiantly this debate was the team from the proposition side, Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Mining, and of course on the opposition, fierce competitors, we had the Water Resources Authority. Now I tell you this, the smile on my face, it's genuine. It's a good way to start the day, yes? Excellent contest. A round of applause, please, for both teams. So, what did we get and how did we analyze the argumentation in this match? So, the proposition team starts by characterizing what is meant by a totalitarian regime. And a totalitarian regime, as the name suggests, entails total control and imposition by the government of that country. Yes? It is an encroachment. It is an unjustified infringement and sort of a curtailment on people's rights that exist in these countries. Now, that was seemingly an important characterization to levy in this debate so as to make it clear that they understand on team proposition what they're dealing with. But then they contested that there are ways in which an alternative state, another state, must treat with such a situation. They say to us, true to their burden in this debate, that to impose harsh economic sanctions is not the way to do it. They say these totalitarian regimes have a godlike complex. They need to be maintaining political power. And because of their need so to do, they utilize the sanctions as a kind of propagandizing instrument. They cause the people to become antagonistic against the countries who are imposing those sanctions. They say to us that these regimes, they need to exist, they need to live, they need to survive. And because of their need to survive, what they do, they impose severe measures on their people. They double down. They intensifies the harshness and the pain upon their people. And they say that is primarily why sanctions, economic sanctions, are the most inappropriate tool to treat with these countries. So on one hand, they're not agreeing that these totalitarian regimes are good, but they're saying there are worse ways of dealing with it. Economic sanctions are just an example. Now, of course, we get from a team opposition a bit of a pushback. They say to us that economic sanctions, harsh economic sanctions, are important and instrumental in terms of leading to the kinds of softening of these regimes. We hear the example of South Africa and the apartheid environment, where they say the whites in South Africa, feeling the pain of the economic sanctions, went to the administration, the government, and said, listen, you have to soften up because the pain is too harsh on us. And they say to us that, for example, in Myanmar, when it is that fuel oil was prevented from getting to that country and getting to that regime, they were therefore unable to mete out the worst kinds of atrocities on their people. So the examples coming to us from opposition were quite good in terms of proving the arguments that they were seeking to prove in this debate. One of the concerns we had is on team proposition. We get some principled arguments like how it is that these regimes generally respond. What we didn't get, certainly from the first speaker's characterization, is beyond the principles, some pragmatics as to how it is that those kinds of examples unfold. So one example, for instance, was, well, them telling us that, well, these totalitarian regimes, the governments in these societies, generally double down and impose tremendous punitive measures on their people, and use the imposition of the sanctions as a rallying call or as a sort of an impetus to promulgate propaganda and hate for the imposing country. We wanted to hear some examples of that happening. Those examples came rather late. We think that strategically those examples were a little misplaced in the context of team proposition. But similarly, a concern resides in the realm of the argumentation coming to us from team opposition. Pointing to singular examples where their arguments work, we don't think they did enough to universalize these examples. So, for example, when they say to us that we're seeing a shift away from blunt tools to more precise scalpel, is the terminologies that they used. And then later on in their team's case, we get the example of how it is that during the pandemic, Cuba, a country faced with a lot of sanctions, economic and otherwise, they were allowed because of UN arrangements to receive vaccines to help their people. That we think is a useful example to an extent. We needed to hear more sort of characterization as to what is it, for example, is the arrangement within the United Nations such that the sanctions, once imposed anywhere, there is a kind of a humanitarian caveat that exists, yes? So a lot of the ideas that we get were needed rather to be proven to be true in a sort of a pragmatic sort of arrangement from the proposition, and ultimately proven to be principally universally the case from the opposition, broadly speaking. Now, I should pause here to tell you in the judge's assessment how the points stack up. We felt that the winning team in a match that where both teams scored very high, the winning team did very, very well, ending with 297 points. 297 points. That's out of 365 points. So very, very impressive job. And that compares to another commendable, another commendable performance by the second place team. That is 279 points. So very well done to both teams. Yes, applaud them, please. Ladies and gentlemen, the winner of this match and the team that first advances to the semi-final round of the public sector debate competition for 2025 is, drum roll, yes, the team from the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Mining, the proposition team. So congratulations to team proposition on winning this match, and very well done team opposition, Water Resources Authority. Now I hear there's a big beautiful gift basket somewhere in the room, and that gift basket will be handed to the best debater of this match. I now invite Aniki Clark to come forward with that gift basket, and that gift basket will be presented to a debater from the winning team. Is it the first speaker? The second? The third? It is indeed, ladies and gentlemen, the second speaker from the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Mining. Congratulations to all the debaters in this match, and a very special congratulations to the best debater. Ladies and gentlemen, I won't say we hope, we know you enjoyed this match, as did we, and we know that you will stick and stay, and in fact you'll call your friends and family members and everybody to join us on this platform for the second match. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. See you soon.